everyone. Welcome to Empowering Exceptional Minds, the podcast diving into neurodiversity through real conversations with parents, individuals, and professionals on challenges, strengths, and unique experiences. I'm your host, Maayan Koren, an educational therapist, ADHD educator, and ASD specialist. At Educational Therapy LLC, my private practice, we support kids and adults with executive function and learning differences toward confidence and independence. This podcast is a collaboration with Wiz Therapy, connecting individuals to providers and streamlining services for neurodiverse communities. Our goal is to share strategies, stories, and insights to empower families, educators, and professionals. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by our guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of this podcast or Wiz Therapy. The conversations here are for information and empowerment, not a substitute for professional or medical advice. And most importantly, if you are experiencing a mental health emergency, please dial 911 immediately, or you can text 741-741 to reach the crisis text line in the US for support. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Empowering Exceptional Minds. I have a smile year to year because I'm here with Dr. Korb, and he and I, we know each other for about 6 years, I would say. And it's truly a pleasure to sit down with you today. And I'm really excited for our audience and the families listening to learn more about your work and about you too. For those who may not know, you will know now that Dr. Korb is a developmental and behavioral pediatrician. He was also the past president of the Society of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics and the author of Raising an Organized Child. Great book, people go buy it. And the creator of Organized Students. He's been helping many years families to understand how to support kids in building the skills they need to thrive at school and in life. Dr. Korb, thank you so much for being here today.
My pleasure. Good morning.
Good morning. Did I miss anything in my introduction that you want to add?
I think, well, I have 5 kids. I think that's relevant when we're talking about child development.
It does. Good for you. So actually, we're going to start with one of my first questions that I like to ask everybody is because it's really fascinating how, being a child developmental and neuroscience and being a father, right? So if you can walk us through your personal path, what drew you to the work that you do?
So my path in retrospect makes a lot of sense. But as I was going through it, I had no idea I'd end up being a developmental behavioral pediatrician. In fact, I didn't even know they existed. It's such a unique specialty. There's only 800 of us in the entire country. And so it was something I had to discover along the way. So if you look back at my history, when I was in college, I ran track and field events, or I directed track and field events for kids with special needs. I was a big brother for an abused child. I taught in kindergarten class, and then I majored in psychobiology, which is now neuroscience, they call it. And so then I went to medical school thinking I would be the best neurosurgeon or the best orthopedic surgeon. And after about 2 or 3 days, I realized that me and surgeons don't have a lot in common. So you go through medical school and you try everything along the way. And along the way, I liked pediatrics and I liked psychiatry. And I looked at both of those residencies and decided that psychiatrists didn't get to play with their patients as much as pediatricians. So I liked that avenue and I went pediatrics. And then once you do pediatrics, you rotate through every pediatric specialty. You do pediatric cardiology and ICU and the NICU for the little babies and immunology and child development and adolescent medicine. And I liked child development and I liked adolescent medicine. And I went and interviewed for fellowships in both, or resident fellowships in both of those. And as I interviewed for the adolescent medicine ones, just a large portion of that is gynecology. And I just thought as a male physician, if I was a 15-year-old girl, I'd much rather have a female physician doing it. I thought I'd be at a disadvantage in that profession my entire life. So I kind of chose by default developmental behavioral pediatrics, which once I got there was an incredible home run and ended up being perfect mend of the psychobiology that I studied in college, my love for children, and just the understanding of how children grow over time and how that impacts their behavioral uh, and medical care.
That's a really interesting journey. I never knew that about you. This is so cool. Thank you for sharing. I'm curious though, how many students were you in those classes for developmental pediatrics?
How
Were
many
you a lot?
students how many students in the developmental behavioral pediatrics classes?
Yeah,
So,
it
so
was.
in medical school, you get very little developmental behavioral pediatrics. Pediatricians get only very limited exposure to things like ADHD and autism in their classes. They get more of it in their practicums. So when they're
Mhm.
actually seeing patients, kids come in with those common conditions. But in their lectures, they don't get a whole lot of that. So in classes, we didn't get exposed to it. When I did my fellowship and was actually studying developmental behavioral pediatrics, where I was at University of North Carolina, um, Chapel Hill was one of the major centers, and there were only two fellows at the time. So
Wow.
there weren't a lot of people um, studying what I was studying.
I don't think that there still are.
There are not. We get about 30 new ones a year.
That's not a lot if you're
That's not a
looking
lot because that
nationwide.
means that if you look at the numbers, there's about for every one developmental behavioral pediatrician, there's about 200,000 children with learning disabilities or mental health problems. So it's a unbelievable uphill battle where we are about the most underserved specialty in the country, and a lot of it comes down to reimbursement rates are really low for child development services.
Yeah, that's very tricky. So I do have a question. Do you remember like a meaningful, I don't know, patience or that you were like, oh my gosh, I so happy I took this route, I can do this and open the
I mean,
center.
I've been doing this for 21 years, Maayan, so I have
I
hundreds,
know.
hundreds and hundreds of those stories. I mean, gosh,
Okay, choose
I tell
one.
this one sometimes about this is about uh, there were twins that I met that had autism about 20 years ago, and I explained the diagnosis and gave the diagnosis to both of the twins. So on this day, mom came in and learned both of her 8-year-olds had autism and hadn't realized it at the time and um, offered them a lot of support over the next year or so. And then I moved to a new job and I didn't see them for about uh, 10, 11 years. And I got a note from the mom talking about one of her younger children who had actually tragically just died of a heart attack. And um, and she emailed me this wonderful letter talking about how uh, I had mentioned to them that, it's their strengths much more than their weaknesses that buoy a kid and make them special. And so help them find their interests and allow them to be great at what they like. And for this one little boy, it was dance. He loved dance. And even though socially he really struggled, he loved to perform. He performed in front of his entire school. Um, and and that was the one thing that made, she said hundreds and hundreds of students showed up at his funeral because they just loved his energy and watching him perform. And just the fact that mom, in the middle of the most tragic event in her life, stopped to send a letter to somebody that she talked to 10 years ago. That's incredibly memorable.
It is. It is. And this is a very sad story, but also very empowering, I think. Um, I want to touch on one thing when we're talking, because you're talking and I'm thinking about um
the grief sometimes that parents go through when it's not the child that they thought they're going to have. And um and maybe this is where the job of developmental pediatrician, like in the line of the profession, is different from pediatrics, right? As a whole.
Well, I think,
With the
when
support.
I sit down and talk to a family, I spend about 2 hours with them. And a pediatrician gets, 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So I get to know the depth of what's going on in the family and their concerns and, like you say, their expectations.
Mm-hmm.
And and expectations, as you know, dealing with kids and behavior, expectations has everything to do with behavior and disappointment and frustration. A lot of kids act out because they expect things to go a certain way. It doesn't go the way they expect. They're not very good at anticipating a natural outcome, so they're frequently disappointed and then they have meltdowns. Well, parents can get the same kind of expectation and disappointment. And I think the focus should not be on what you want your child to be someday.
Mm-hmm.
The focus
Mm-hmm.
should be on where's your child at right now
Yeah.
and how do I move them one step forward?
Yeah.
It's not about where should all fourth graders be because my child is in fourth grade. It's about where is my child and what are the next steps to help them become more independent and more self-sufficient and better thinkers.
Yeah. I could not say it better. That it's really meeting them where they're at right now.
Exactly.
Um, so just to kind of, before we move on to more of your area of expertise, if we can, our audience is very wide and varied, and some even out of the country. We have listeners from Europe. Hey, Europe people, and Asia. So thank you for listening. I do have a question that I know we're talking about US. We are both of us specifically in California, which is kind of a bubble. But I do want to ask, what are the differences between general pediatrician, and I know you touched some of it, and a developmental pediatrician, and can you break that down? So what do you do, right, that is actually different, and in what point should the family stop waiting and ask for a referral?
Well,
Because most of the time it goes straight to the pediatrician, right? And not everybody is a developmental pediatrician.
and the pediatrician is probably the right first step. I mean,
Yeah.
again, there's only 800 of us, and if everybody came to us first, the lines would be
don't
forever.
come to don't come to Dr. Korb first, please.
They already are long, but they would be infinitely long. Um, so first, let's just talk about the training. Every pediatrician goes through a pediatric residency. They do 4 years of medical school and then 3 years of pediatric residency. And in that residency, they rotate 1 month in this specialty and 1 month in that specialty, and they get this broad understanding of pediatrics. Now, people who choose to specialize, like a pediatric cardiologist or a pediatric developmental behavioral pediatrician, choose to do a fellowship. So in developmental behavioral pediatrics right now, the fellowship's 3 years long. So you do an additional 3 years where all you do is you work in interdisciplinary teams. So in my fellowship, I sat next to psychologists and occupational therapists and speech language pathologists and educators, and I learned all about child development. My 3 years was entirely focused on learning disabilities and autism and ADHD and how typical development works and when there are variations, how to recognize those variations. So there's a much deeper understanding of child development um, that a developmental behavioral pediatrician has than a pediatrician. And equally as important, developmental behavioral pediatrics recognizes that developmental care doesn't happen in a vacuum. Children are in a family, that family's in a community, that community has schools, and we have a good understanding of how all of these systems work because most of the children we see have multiple developmental needs or struggles, and we need to connect them to all of the supports in the community so we can optimize their development and care.
Thank you for clarifying the differences. So the first step is reach out to your pediatrician, primary care, family if you're in Canada, and then move on if needed more. So my next question for you is your book, because I found it really interesting. And so Dr. Korb's book, Raising an Organized Child, if you can please reframe what organism means for kids, because for parents who hear that title and immediately picture, okay, we got a color-coded binder, we're gonna put all the stuff in the cubbies, let's do like organization. But what does it mean to be like, what truly the meaning of for this in child development?
Exactly. When I'm talking about organization, I'm not just talking about finding two socks that match. I'm talking about the neurodevelopmental functions that lead to a child's ability to do higher level thinking, to think organized. So to be able to do things like grasping the big picture, to understanding relevance, to having insight, to anticipating, to be able to plan. All of those skills are these multi-level, um, simultaneous processing functions of the brain that are very complex. And and it starts with little building blocks from the time the child is born all the way into young adulthood. We can be working on those. And in the book, I illustrate 5 steps that all parents can take to help build these executive functions in their children.
Can you share a
Sure,
little bit?
you want to share the 5 steps? The 5 steps are: be consistent, because there's a lot of data that kids learn best when things are consistently reinforced. We also know that from the time children are infants, that that consistency with bedtimes, consistency with feeding, consistency with warmth and changing their diapers, that kind of consistency lowers stress. It lowers cortisol levels, which is the stress hormone in the brain. Kids that are born in orphanages where they get picked up 3 times a day and fed and changed and stuck back in a bed with another child, those kids have toxic stress, and it actually burns holes in the part of the brain that are, or it can burn holes in the part of the brain that are critical for this executive function thinking. So just by being consistent with your infant, you're already supporting an environment where they're more likely to build these executive functions.
This
The
is really
second step,
interesting.
the
Mhm.
second step is introduce order. So everything has order, and one way of organizing things is sequentially. So whether it's the language of order we use, we count every step we walk up, so they recognize numbers. They, um, we teach them that everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. We take out a toy, we play with the toy, we put away the toy. Everything has a beginning, a middle, and end, so they can recognize that homework's not done until it's actually handed in to the teacher. Just doing the homework isn't doing the homework. It's only done if you turn it in. Everything has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You take out the food, you prepare the meal, you eat the meal, you put away the meal. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to everything. So we teach them that there's steps that can be taken, that every task can be broken down into steps so that they see the inherent order in everything. Then step 3 is we give everything a place. So being able to use your spatial organization is a more efficient way of processing than sequential organization. Just like when we're learning to read, when we first sound things out, it works, but it's not as quick as once we learn to sight word read. Once we're sight word reading, it becomes a quicker way of reading. Um, so, and there's also certain things that you can only do with spatial memory. Like if I'm trying to memorize your face, Maayan, I'm not going to say that there's an eye over here and then 3 centimeters over there, there's an eye, and somewhere below that is no. And I'm going to look at your face, I'm going to take a picture of it in my mind, and it becomes a more efficient way of processing. And we build those skills by having the place where their stuffed animals go, and having the place where their clothes go, and having an organized house so they recognize that things have space and they can have these mental images that they can form consistently of where things go. It'll help someday when they need to keep things in their backpack. The third
Or their
step,
college room
or
organized.
their college dorm, right? The fourth step, I'm sorry, I'm on number four, is to practice forward thinking. So forward thinking is interesting because the part of your brain that's involved in foresight is also involved in hindsight. And so if you want your kids to learn from their mistakes, the way you train that skill is by teaching them to think ahead. So do things like estimating. How long do you think it's going to take for us to get home? Predicting. What do you think Dad will want for his birthday? What do you think we need to bring on this trip? Planning. All of those forward thinking, anticipating, predicting, planning that are so important, not just for getting your schoolwork done, but also your behavior. I had mentioned anticipating before. If you anticipate winning every time you play a game, then you're going to be really disappointed. But if you can sit back and say, I'm going to try my hardest, and there's a chance I might win and a chance I might lose, then I'm prepared for the fact that I might lose, and it's not as devastating, and I'm not the kid throwing tantrums on the sidelines at the soccer game. So we teach these forward thinking skills. And then the last step is to promote problem solving. And problem solving really has a lot to do with independence because in life we are going to have problems. And probably the most common problem we have is boredom. And
Mhm.
right now, I think we as parents have deprived our kids of solving that problem by having phones available. They default to their phone whenever they feel bored, and they don't have to sit back and go, okay, they don't develop that drop down menu in their mind of what are all the things I could do when I'm feeling bored. And and as a result, I think we're seeing kids that have more trouble launching into adulthood these days than we did 20 years ago before the iPhone came out. I can still say 20 years. It was 2007. Um, I think that problem solving is really important. So this is where when I talked about knowing where your child's at, you want to, from the time that they're very little, give them increasing amounts of independence so that they do struggle and they do have to solve problems. Your job is to not give them so much independence that they, get hit by cars and run out um, in the middle of the street naked. But you provide a certain amount of protection, but you give them independence so that they can struggle through things. And Maayan, you as an educator know that too, that struggle is part of learning.
Yeah,
That when kids um, don't ever take academic risks, they have much more trouble learning. And so that's step five. Those are the five steps that we talk about in detail. And as I wrote the book, I talk about how you can apply those five steps to infancy, to toddlers, to preschoolers, to school age kids, to adolescents, because those five steps apply all the way across the lifespan of your child.
absolutely. Everything is about those 5 steps. So thank you for writing this very needed book. You're talking and I'm thinking about, oh my gosh, and all this like planning is so much um like needed when it comes to making the simulation in your mind. So you have to visualize. And I'm not gonna throw a curveball at you, but I'm gonna try. What are you gonna do with somebody who can have like aphantasia, cannot see pictures in their mind? So planning, oh, so we cannot like really say, oh, so how do you see it happening for you, right?
So, when we're talking about organization, nobody is perfect at organization. We all have strengths and weaknesses. And like anything, we learn to lean on our strengths and then we exercise our weaknesses. So the question I often get that's related to yours is if I'm a parent and I'm not very organized, how do I help my child become organized? And I say that your effort to become organized shows that you value organization and your child will pick up on that. And if you're very sequential organized, then make a lot of lists and teach your child how to use those lists to compensate for some of your spatial disorganization. Or vice versa. If you're very spatially organized, take pictures of things and try to reproduce the things that you created once they were organized in the past by using your visual spatial skills. There's different ways that you can go about using your strengths to compensate for your weaknesses.
So how does it gonna look like in academic setting?
In an academic setting, so let's say somebody has spatial weaknesses, and so things and old food are always disappearing in the bottom of their backpack. So I might have them create a checklist of the things that go in their backpack. And every time they put things in their backpack, they look at their checklist that's written on their backpack. It says, is your homework in your binder? Is your binder in the first section? Did you clean out your lunch? Did and we create it sequentially. So that's how it could work from that standpoint. If you're somebody who isn't very sequentially organized and you have to write an essay, and writing an essay is a series of steps. I brainstorm my ideas, I move them into order, I write my topic sentences, I then create my supporting arguments. Then I go back and check my editing and my spelling, and I do it in steps. But if you're not as good at steps, then you can use web mapping techniques where you organize your ideas in diagram forms and see how they relate. There's different ways that you can adjust based on the child's thinking and planning skills.
Yeah, this is why I always say that I always talk about it in this podcast about writing, that it's so heavy on executive functioning. And even just giving a kid a graphic organizer is not, it's not going to do it for them, because they need the step before the graphic organizing, which is like organize what's in your brain,
Right.
like your thoughts.
Yep.
So mind mapping is great. And yeah, so it's a great tool to do prior the graphic organizer. I don't want to go into writing too much because this is not what we are here
But I
today,
agree
but
that
it's all related.
writing is one of the greatest working memory challenges of school.
Oh yeah.
It's you're having to do so many things simultaneously, and that's really what the working memory is responsible for. And it makes it very difficult. So if you can learn to do it in steps that work for you, for some people, that's a tremendously efficient way to work.
Same with math though, because they need to rely on working memory more than reading. I would say no, reading comprehension, they do need to rely on working memory. Like, but with math, you have also to um estimate and plan and how I'm going to show my work, the steps. So it's very, very heavy. And this is where we are looking on neurodiverse population. If we are looking on dyscalculia or any kind of ADHD, right, or autism, that we might gonna have some challenges with the executive functioning, especially if we are talking about ADHD.
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, kids, first of all, I would say that the executive functions happen in that prefrontal cortex part of your brain. Much of your attention functions and your impulse control happens in that prefrontal cortex part of your brain, although the attention clearly has links to all over the brain because you got to pay attention to what you hear and you see and you taste and you smell and everything. But much of those functions happen there, and the working memory is related to that prefrontal cortex as well. And so when we see a kid with ADHD, it's really common, although not universally true, that they have working memory difficulties, and organization is inherently a little more difficult for many of them.
And also, when the working memory is, I would say, not the strength, when we have challenges in working memory, it will also can cause stress because we are trying to really hard to remember what is happening and to apply it.
But there are many ways to accommodate for a relatively weak working memory.
Absolutely.
There are all
Yeah.
kinds of strategies you can use. You just have to find a student who's willing to use them. And that's sometimes hard when you're dealing with a tween or a teenager.
Yeah, that's true.
Mhm.
Yeah, we want them to master the skill. And there are many things out there. I mean, this is like in the line of my work, right? Is to teach them the strategies to help support working memory and see what fits with their way they, um, using this in school or in their lives.
So I don't, one of the things that in addition to the book, I created a online executive function teaching tool for teens.
Oh,
So it has about 40 lessons. It's called organizedstudents.com.
okay.
And it's got about 40 lessons that just teach all of these steps. And it's not intended for students to use every one of them. It, it,
Mhm.
it it has ones that deal with if you're not very good at planning, here's ways to get better at planning. If you're not very good at anticipating what your teacher wants on tests, here's ways to think about that. If you have trouble paying attention, here's some tools you can use. If you have difficulty getting started and you tend to procrastinate, here's some strategies on that. And each one of these lessons is about 5 short paragraphs and a little tiny quiz that they can take. And it's easy to work through. And it's at their own pace, and it's if you ever look it up, it's about the most affordable online executive function class by a factor of 10 that you could find out there. Our goal is to make it accessible and available to people.
Appreciate it. I'll put a link in the body of the description so people check it out.
Thank you.
Um, so we kind of about to finish up our podcast episode, which as always I'm like just listening you talk about this. I'm like, oh, this is great. So from your clinical experience, what are the early signs that parents and teachers often overlook or dismiss, um, signs that a child might benefit from a developmental evaluation?
That's incredibly broad because, there's different signs for autism than there are for attention difficulties.
Right.
There's different signs for learning disabilities than there are for autism and attention. So all of those things are different. I guess if you want to put it in general terms, what I would
Mm-hmm.
say is if there's something causing a problem, it's a problem. Meaning, if my child isn't running as fast as the other kids and can't keep up in soccer, well, that's a problem. I should look into that. If my child has difficulty expressing himself as well as the other kids, that's a problem. If my child doesn't know how to walk up to another kid and say hello, and the other kids do, that's a problem. And so, anything that holds back a child is worth looking into because we have so much data that early intervention makes a
Mm-hmm.
difference. And if we can get these kids connected to supports, proper supports, it can make lifelong benefits for the kids. It's the best investment that you can do for your child is get them the supports that they need.
And I would do a shout out because both you and I are parents. Listen to your guts. I mean, if you feel something is wrong, listen to your guts and get help. Um, because you know your child best.
There's great studies, old studies by a woman named Frances Glasgow, and what she studied was if a parent says their child has a motor problem, they are right like 80 to 90% of the time. If their parent says the child has a learning problem, they're right like 80 to 90% of the time. They're incredibly accurate at predicting a problem. So if they come forward to a pediatrician and say, I need help with this, pediatricians should take it seriously. The only thing where parents tend to underestimate the problem is when it comes to speech, because parents can somehow know what their kids want and nobody else can understand their kids. So they tend to underestimate how much of a problem their children have with speech.
That's a very good point. I would even say that if your child is also behind sometimes with reading and writing or have challenges expressing themselves verbally, that's also a speech. So we need to kind of take that into account that something is up with the language and how the brain processes language. Um, so I know it was like a really broad question, but thank you for kind of empowering the parents that listening to this podcast. And I always say that not everybody can afford services. Not everybody can, maybe because they are far away, or maybe they're in a country that is not as knowledge about these kind of things. That's what I said, we are in a bubble. These are great tips for everybody who's out there.
The other thing, Maayan, that's really important is the families that bring their children to me later are the ones that don't take their kids to the park. They don't have play dates with other kids because they don't have the opportunity to see the comparison. They don't really understand what typical, I mean, this is their only child. They weren't brought up with a lot of kids, and so it's understandable. But the way you figure that out is you join, father and daughter groups. You join the swim team. You see your children around other kids, and then you recognize, oh, this looks like it's harder and easier, not bad or good, but just you learn that comparison by being around other children.
Yeah, and they learn from each other also. I mean, we are human beings. We
Sure,
need
there's
that.
absolute benefit to that.
Yeah, we need this too in behavioral, right? That's what we do. We are behavioral creatures. Any takeaway, Dr. Korb? What do you want our listeners to take away from this conversation?
I want parents to become experts on their own children. I want them to figure out or learn about where their own child is at and then push them one step forward. If their child is, in second grade, um, have them try to make their own breakfast. Have them try to pack their own lunch. And if they can't do it, figure out how to scaffold that task so that they can learn to do it themselves. We want to figure out where they're at and give them enough independence so that they can continue to move forward from the time they're 2 all the way to they're 22.
I love it. This is amazing. Thank you so much for being here today. We will definitely have all the information. If you guys are looking for more information, I will put links in the comment section or the description section. Please share this with your families and friends. Dr. Korb, thank you so much for being here today. You're so knowledgeable. It's great to
My
have you.
pleasure. Yeah, nice to talk to you too.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel and help us grow. Thank you.